Closed captioning is provided as a public service by the state of South Carolina.
"Oh, what a tangled web we weave when first we practice to deceive," wrote Sir Walter Scott in 1808. That quote sums up what Reconstruction was all about in South Carolina: deceit, and what a tangled web it was. The Civil War had ended, but another was just starting. This time the battle would be politics. The issue was how South Carolina would be governed. The federal government was determined that South Carolina and the other southern states would reorganize their state governments so that slavery would be forever abolished. The plantation owners were equally determined that they would revert to the old rules, while the former slaves were just as determined that the old rules would not be observed. When the dust finally settled, South Carolina's sons and daughters had been involved in murders, riots, and fraud.
The problems started after the Civil War. The states that had supported the Confederacy were now under federal rule until it was deemed safe for them to act on their own and once again be part of the United States. This period of federal military control in South Carolina lasted for 12 years, from 1865 to 1877. These were turbulent years as the New South fought the old domain. But change, both socially and economically, was not to be hindered for the white class in South Carolina that once ruled over 400,000 slaves. The election of 1876 was to be an important turning point for South Carolina politics. As our elections today are, it was a Republican versus a Democrat. It was Daniel Henry Chamberlain, a Republican, against Wade Hampton III, a Democrat. Chamberlain served in the United States Army, and Hampton was a Confederate veteran. It was like fighting the Civil War all over again, and violence became the norm. And like the Civil War determined the fate of African Americans, this election too determined their fate.
And when the votes were all counted, it was a first for the state, because in 1876, South Carolina elected two governors, one a Republican and one a Democrat. Both sides cried foul on who was really the winner, and both claimed victory, each holding an inauguration.
The Republican, Daniel Chamberlain, had the backing of federal troops and was the incumbent.
And the Democrat, Wade Hampton III, had the backing of the red shirts. Who were the red shirts? Well, they were a force to be reckoned with, and no one, not even the United States military, wanted to tangle with them.
You have to understand the times. When we got back from fighting the war, our farms were in ruins. Slaves had been freed, so there was no labor.
We were free, but free to do what? We had no money, no land to call our own. Yet, it was a time of hope. But then, the red shirts came along. That year, 1876, killed any hope we had of being equal. And power? What little power we did have, well, we lost that too.
We red shirts first appeared in South Carolina in Charleston on August 25th, 1876, during a Democrat parade. Most of us were Confederate veterans, and we proudly wore our red shirts as we marched along.
They sound so peaceful, don't they? But what the red shirts were was anything but peaceful. In reality, they were gun clubs, and they were wearing those red shirts, taunting African Americans like a bullfighter waving its red shirt in front of the bull. For we knew what those red shirts meant.
What those red shirts meant was that we wouldn't be broken down by swindlers who had taken over our government. And we wore red because we were mocked when Senator Benjamin Franklin Butler of Massachusetts held up a shirt stained with blood, saying the man had been whipped and beat by the Ku Klux Klan. The Klan was just men from the community upholding community values.
Values of the white planter class who believed that slavery should still be in existence.
What were in existence were carpetbaggers running our state government. You know what a carpetbagger is. A man who enters politics just to get wealthy. Came down from the north carrying his valuables in a woolen carpet bag. We couldn't pay the taxes on our plantations, on our homes. So these carpetbaggers bought them up cheap. They lived on our sorrow. So we banded together to fight their corruption. And these red shirts showed that we were unified.
Those red shirts meant that these men were armed and dangerous and ready to fight anyone who disagreed with their politics. They wanted to run the state government.
Republicans ran the state government. First, we thought we could trust Governor Chamberlain. Sure, he's a Yankee, but he seemed to understand the white farmer and the problems he was facing. He won our trust.
Sure liked Governor Chamberlain. He believed in equality. But then, Hamburg happened.
And once Hamburg happened,
things were never the same.
And the Hamburg Massacre.
And it was a massacre.
The Hamburg Massacre taught us that we couldn't trust Chamberlain. So we couldn't let Chamberlain get reelected. Not another 4 years of him. That's why the election of 1876 was so important. It was time for Reconstruction to end. It was time for the Democrats and not the Republicans to run the state government. So we picked our own candidate to run against the incumbent Governor Chamberlain. Wade Hampton III. Old Wade would set things right if he got elected, and by golly, he was going to get elected. And he needed the red shirts to get him elected, because if every white man voted in the state of South Carolina, it still wouldn't be as many votes as the black votes. 60% of the voters were black. So the number of former slaves are more than the number of white votes. So these carpetbaggers got elected by the former slaves who didn't know how to read and write. How are they going to understand politics?
Oh, we understood politics all right. We understood that we wanted the right to vote and to own land. And if we did work for the white man, to get paid in money. And we were told all that came with freedom. But what we didn't count on was what looked good on paper just didn't happen in real life. Oh, the planters, they gave us contracts to work their land. It was called sharecropping, and it seemed like a good idea. The landlords provided the land and tools to crop, and in turn, we gave him a percentage of our profits. But over time, instead of profits, we found ourselves buried in debt. It takes a while for crops to grow, but we needed money to survive. So we borrowed from the plantation owners, who was our landlords and partners in sharecropping. But the more we borrowed, the more in debt we got. But what else were we to do? No one would hire us for any other jobs, because the white plantation owners conspired to make sure that the only work around for us to do was toiling the fields. And if someone did try to help us find another job, the red shirts would retaliate.
We didn't have a choice. We tried to work through the government. After the War of Northern Invasion, we held a convention to vote on new laws to reflect a new way of life.
New ways? It was the old ways disguised as new ways. The laws they created use words like master and servant. But those laws were written in a way to keep African Americans working for the white plantation owners as slaves.
How could that be when we voted to ratify the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery?
They also voted for new laws called black codes, which meant that African Americans were not entitled to the same social and political equality with white people. Travel was limited, and if we wanted to engage in trade, we had to pay an exorbitant license fee. And if we did sign a labor contract to leave the premises, we had to get permission from the master. The master? And I thought we were free. The Black Code was created as a disguise to reinstitute slavery. Why South Carolina refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, giving us the right to vote. How fair is that?
Oh, it's fair, all right. I'm a farmer, and I can tell you right now that if the former slaves don't work for us, the agricultural economy of South Carolina will collapse. And if the farms die out, so does the state of South Carolina. So if South Carolina is to survive, we had to pass these laws for the good of all, black and white.
Well, the Congress of the United States disagreed, and within 10 days, the Black Code was no more, declared invalid, and the new Constitutional Convention was held. This time, the new laws enacted equality to all.
How can it be equal when only 36 of the delegates are native born? The rest were northern interlopers or former slaves. If we have no say, how can we honor that legal document? After all, a government that is not seen as legitimate by a significant number of its citizens is vulnerable to insurgency. So that's what we did. It was our right.
Their rights? What about the rights of African Americans? By the fall of 1870, South Carolina witnessed terrorism like never before. While just in Lawrenceville, 2,000 armed whites murdered 9 Republicans, including a state legislator, a probate judge, and a constable. Violence was all over the state. But like water stopping a fire, the election of Governor Daniel H. Chamberlain seemed to stop the raging fire of violence. He supported reform.
Reform? The South Carolina government was one of the most corrupt in the nation, and that included Governor Chamberlain.
Was never proved he benefited from fraud.
Let me tell you what happened. The state's financial board, of which Governor Chamberlain was one of 3 members, secured the authority to print $1,000 bonds numbered 1 to 1,000. Well, they printed those bonds all right, but they printed 2 sets, sold both. Nothing but corruption. I will admit, once he was governor, he seemed to change from his old habits. Governor Chamberlain kicked out of office many a corrupt and uneducated politician. For a time, we thought things may get better under his leadership. We should have known. Once a crook, always a crook. That's why we support the Democrat Party.
Let me tell you about the Democrats during Reconstruction. Republicans may have ruled the state, both in legislature and the governor, but they couldn't do anything under President Johnson, especially with him being a Southerner and sympathizing with the white planters. And many a nights, the Republican officials hid in the woods so not to be beaten up by the Democratic Party. But then U.S. Grant was elected president. He changed things around.
He arrested a lot of our white citizens.
Sure did. There were so many arrested that most of the cases were thrown out. It was too many to prosecute. So these men figured that if the law wouldn't prosecute, then why stop the violence? And once more, violence reared its ugly head.
Let's face it, violence was necessary in those days. We used it to curb corruption in our state government. While we were known as the noble saviors of our state, if it hadn't been for us, men would have been killed. It was terrible times then. Violence against the white man was everywhere.
Violence against the African man was everywhere. African Americans were killed. Terrible, terrible times, especially in Hamburg. The hopes for peace and equality in our state ended in Hamburg, South Carolina.
It was in Hamburg that we red shirts became a force to be reckoned with.
None of us will forget what happened in that small, sleepy town. It was July. It had been a hot summer, and Hamburg was a predominantly black town in Aiken County. The black militia were marching, practicing. That's all.
That's all? That militia harassed white travelers, and the white travelers followed the law by filing a lawsuit.
The militia didn't do anything wrong.
The travelers didn't do anything wrong. These travelers were driving a carriage, requested the militia to allow them to pass. It was a public road, and they had every right to travel on it.
They could have drove on the right side of the road, but no, they had to drive in the center where the militia was practicing.
The militia blocked the road. The captain of the militia,
A black man.
who got downright mean with the white man, hostile just because a white man asked to drive down a road.
And a disagreement.
Days later, turned into a fight.
There was a killing.
On both sides.
But it was only the black men who were murdered at Hamburg. I know, for my husband was one of the men murdered.
Hundreds of whites wearing red shirts descended on Hamburg, and there was a skirmish between the red shirts and the black militia. One white and one black was killed. The militia surrendered their weapons. 6 black militia were murdered in cold blood. Governor Chamberlain asked President Grant for the Army's help, for he condemned what those men had done.
Chamberlain swore he never contacted Grant. Deceit. That's exactly what he did. He lied right out to us. We thought he was on our side.
But he was on ours. He condemned what happened.
That's why men all over the state joined the red shirts.
And that was the beginning of the red shirt terror.
Terror? We were the ones who lived in terror. There were black militia all over the state armed with the latest weapons by Governor Chamberlain. We just made sure that whites were treated the same as blacks and weren't shot.
From that point on, it was like the Civil War again. Only this time, it was between blacks and whites.
Between Republicans and Democrats. We weren't about to get along. One of us had to rule South Carolina.
Lots of killing across our state, especially in the Low Country, where blacks outnumbered whites. Terrible, terrible times. It got so bad that Governor Chamberlain asked Grant for federal troops for assistance. President Grant sent approximately 1,100 federal troops, demanding that the rifle clubs be disbanded.
We disbanded. After all, we were law-abiding citizens.
The only thing the rifle clubs did to evade jail was change their name. The Allendale Rifle Club became the the Allendale Mounted Baseball Club. Some clubs even changed their names to music clubs. But in truth, they were still rifle clubs and dedicated to making sure that Hampton won the election of 1876.
Hampton had to win. Been too many years under Republican rule. Even some Republicans were becoming disenchanted with the Republican Party because of the fraud. And who's paying all the taxes? The white man. We're paying the taxes while the Republican officials are stealing their government blind. Well, things couldn't go on in the government like they've been since Reconstruction began. That's why we got organized. That's why almost 15,000 of us red shirts traveled along with Wade Hampton and the other Democrat candidates to convince the people there was only one choice, the Democrat choice. And Wade Hampton III was the only choice for governor. We just rode along show our support. And our motto was force without violence.
Force with violence was used by the red shirts. Men were driven from their homes, beaten, whipped, all so that a Democrat could win the governor's race.
Our state was the most corrupt in the nation. Things couldn't go on with Republicans' rule in South Carolina. It had to end. And we tried everything we could. We voted, we rallied. There's only one avenue left to us: play by their rules. We had no choice. We had to do everything we could to stop the Republicans from ruling South Carolina.
Why, across the state, armed men blocked the voting polls to prevent voters from entering. They even brought a train of people from Georgia to vote in the South Carolina election. Oh, their goal was to win, all right. They wanted to make sure that you voted for Hampton or else.
We needed the black vote to win. Without it, we didn't have enough votes. Our goal is honorable. All we want are rules that are fair for all of us.
All we want are rules that are fair for all of us.
But the election of 1876 was to be anything but fair. The election of 1876 has long been considered to be the most fraudulent in South Carolina's history. The Democrats organized a rally in every county in the state, and where a Democrat candidate was, the red shirts were. The red shirts were armed and mounted, and when their candidate for governor, Wade Hampton, spoke, well, the red shirts responded enthusiastically. The whippings and murder continued as the red shirts tried to convince every voter to be a Democrat.
One historian estimated that 150 African Americans were killed during this time period, but there was bloodshed on both sides. Hampton promised to end violence, something Chamberlain hadn't even tried to do. Still, despite the threats, the violence, and the promises, or lack thereof, it was a very tight race.
And when it was all over, both Hampton and Chamberlain had won. South Carolina had two governors, and both sides, Democrat and Republican, threatened that there could only be one to rule the state. It was a state of dueling governors.
If that wasn't bad enough, the entire country was having the same problem. Two presidents had been elected. One a Democrat, one a Republican. There were dueling presidents. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes and Democrat Samuel J. Tilden were arguing over who won the election for U.S. president. Hayes was finally declared the winner after Congressional Commission awarded him 20 disputed electoral votes, giving him a narrow win victory. It was now time to decide who would be governor of South Carolina. Both Chamberlain and Hampton met with Hayes, who realized if he supported Chamberlain, then military force would be needed against Hampton, who commanded the loyalty of the white population and also had the largest number of taxpayers and also a fine military in Confederate veterans. It would be Gettysburg all over again. And Hayes ordered the withdrawal of federal troops from South Carolina.
It was official. Hampton was governor. This marked not only the end of the Republican rule, but marked the end of Reconstruction in South Carolina. By the 1890s, there were almost no African Americans or Republicans elected in the state, and this continued for over 50 years. When Governor Chamberlain left office, he wrote, addressing the African American population of South Carolina, "The government of the U.S. abandons you, withdraws its support with full knowledge that the official state government will be speedily overthrown."
Reconstruction had ended in South Carolina. It was a reign marked of fraud, corruption, and deceit. Violence had become an everyday occurrence.
The white planters who had been defeated in the Civil War were now the victors of a civil war of politics. The insurrection in South Carolina had been a success.